Middle-earth has many famous weapons, Anduril, Gurthang, Sting, to name a few, but no weapon has a more interesting story than the sword that Gandalf wielded during The Hobbit and the War of the Ring. It started as the personal blade of Turgon, the King of Gondolin, yet thousands of years later it was found in a troll cave, where it was picked up and used by Gandalf from then onwards. In this video, we talk about Glamdring, the foe hammer, and speculate how it ended up being the sword of the King of Gondolin to a forgotten blade in a cave in the Trollshaws. Glamdring seems to have been forged in the First Age in Gondolin, alongside weapons such as Orcrist, the sword that Thorin Oakenshield later wielded, and possibly even Sting, the dagger that was used by Bilbo and Frodo. Glamdring was the sword of King Turgon, the ruler of the legendary hidden city of Gondolin, and for a time the High King of the Noldor. While in his possession, Glamdring seems to have been used on two occasions, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears and the Fall of Gondolin. Nevertheless, despite its limited use, Glamdring earned quite the reputation, as thousands of years later, orcs in Goblin Town could actually recognise it as well as Orcrist. It was during the Fall of Gondolin where Glamdring was presumed lost. During the final moment of the battle, the Tower of the King was destroyed, and we're told that Turgon died in its ruin. The sword likely would have been buried underneath plenty of rubble, but perhaps needing to confirm that Turgon was actually dead, Morgoth's servants began digging, and miraculously the sword survived. We don't know exactly where the sword went after that, but it almost certainly went to Angband. I don't think Morgoth would have let one of his servants keep the sword for themselves, considering how much he hated Turgon. Like many other prized possessions, it probably ended up deep in Angband's vaults. But less than 100 years later, Angband would fall during the War of Wrath. Many of Morgoth's servants were killed, and Morgoth himself was captured while hiding in the deepest pits. But some of Morgoth's servants, including both dragons and at least one Balrog, were unwilling to share in those fates, and instead they fled east. During the chaos of the fall, it seems that some of Morgoth's servants decided that they weren't leaving empty-handed, so they plundered the vaults, and fled east with some treasure, including Glamdring and other swords from Gondolin. Now, you might be thinking, well, hold up, how do we know that the sword wasn't retrieved from Angband by the elves? The answer to this is that we don't know for certain, but I would consider that extremely unlikely. The reason for this is that if the sword of King Turgon was retrieved, it would have been recognised and then probably given to Turgon's descendants. At this time, this was Elros, the future king of Númenor, and Elrond Half-Elven. There's no record of the sword going to Númenor at any stage, and the kings of Númenor already had a sword, Aranruth, which was actually King Thingol's sword. As for Elrond, it's confirmed in The Hobbit that he'd never seen the sword before. So we can pretty safely say that the sword went east. But what happened to it then? When he identifies the sword, Elrond speculates that it may have ended up in a dragon or goblin horde, and then, after that, it was plundered and plundered and plundered again until it eventually ended up in a troll cave. The Troll Cave certainly wasn't the only resting place after the sword came east. This is because trolls were pushed out of the Trollshaws when Arnor and later Rhudaur existed. This Troll Cave in particular was close to the road, so it was almost certainly a recent inhabitation, meaning that Glamdring could not have been there for that long. But let's go into this a bit deeper. It's clear that Glamdring was likely plundered a number of times, swapping hands until it ended up in a troll cave. So let's ask the question, who did the plundering? This depends on what you make of the runes on Glamdring and how much stock you put into some of the inconsistencies in The Hobbit. When Gandalf found Glamdring, he doesn't initially know who the sword belonged to because he can't read the runes that are carved into it. These are the Gondolinic runes, which Tolkien invented during the 1920s, and they were the first runic system that he invented. The problem with the Gondolinic runes is that they don't fit into the rest of the canon. Basically, they were an abandoned concept. Tolkien recognised this during his short-lived rewrite of The Hobbit in 1960, and instead of implying that Gandalf couldn't read the runes because he didn't understand them, he wrote that Gandalf couldn't read the runes because they were covered in blood. This is important because if Tolkien was planning on retconning the Gondolinic runes, then Glamdring would have been inscribed with the Tengwar script, likely in Quenya or Sindarin. If this was the case, then it seems unlikely that Glamdring and the other weapons ever ended up in the hands of people who would actually recognise Tengwa. If it ended up in the hands of an elf, they would have immediately known it was Turgon's sword, and Elrond probably would have learned of that. If it ended up in the hands of the Dunedain, or possibly even the dwarves, it's likely something similar would have occurred. I think the only way Elrond wouldn't have been informed is if it ended up in the hands of a man who couldn't read the script and had no idea or no care of the blade's historical significance, so maybe a Northman, a Hillman, or a man from Angmar. But if we go with the original writing that Glamdring was inscribed with a secret script that not even Gandalf knew, then the chances of it ending up in the hands of, say, the Dunedain at some point are much higher. For example, a Dunedain Lord of Rhudaur might have destroyed an orc lair in the Misty Mountains, found the sword, and then thought, oh, that's a nice sword, and because they wouldn't be able to read the Gondolinic runes, they would have had no idea the blade belonged to Turgon. If they weren't familiar with or on friendly terms with Elrond, then there's a very good chance he would not have found out that Glamdring had resurfaced. So once again, like many Middle-earth mysteries, the possibilities depend on an inconsistency within The Hobbit that Tolkien identified but never got around to fixing. If the Gondolinic runes are treated as canon, then the sword could have bounced around both men, dwarves, and evil creatures for millennia before it ended up in a troll cave. One fun scenario is that it may have been taken to an orc horde. That horde may have been plundered by dwarves, only to be taken back by orcs. Maybe then, a Dunedain Lord of Rhudaur sacked an orc cave and found the sword, only to lose that sword when he lost his lands to the Hillman who had sided with Angmar. Perhaps a Hillman Lord and his descendants wielded it until they were destroyed during the fall of Angmar. After that, it may have been left abandoned before being found once again by orcs or maybe even trolls, and then it bounced around different caves until it was found by Gandalf during The Hobbit. Alternatively, if we're treating the Gondolinic runes as an inconsistency, which Tolkien recognized himself, then the options are probably much more limited. It still could have ended up in the hands of men or dwarves, but if they could read the runes, then that increases the likelihood that Elrond would have heard of it, which he didn't until The Hobbit. So if this is the case, Glamdring and the other weapons may have only swapped hands amongst evil creatures. Orc tribes did fight each other, so the blade might have bounced around different orc hordes until it was eventually brought down to a troll lair right near to the main road in the Trollshaws. But luckily it was found because it got a lot of great use from Gandalf. He used it in numerous battles, he used it to slay the Goblin King, and he used it to kill the Balrog. We're not told if he took it into the west, but if he did, I'm sure Turgon, presuming that he had left the halls of Mandos at this point, would have been glad to see it again, and would have been extra glad to hear that the sword was used for some fairly legendary deeds. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. One of my subscribers, or at least I hope they're subscribed, asked for a video about this on several of my videos. To whoever that is, this one's for you, and I really need to start writing down the names of the users who gave the suggestion so I can do a proper shout out. Cheers, farewell, and remember, nothing you name in your life will be cooler than the faux hammer.